Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. Today we're stepping into April 23rd, a date that reads less like a calendar entry and more like a highlight reel of humanity's greatest hits and worst instincts. It's a day where empires flex, rebellions collapse, myths are born, and somewhere along the way, a guy at the zoo accidentally invents the modern internet. The connective tissue here isn't just time. It's how people respond to power, whether they challenge it, reshape it, or just try to survive it long enough to write something down about it later. Segment 1 and Martyrs, Myth-Making, and the Power of a Good Story. The story of St. George begins as a fairly straightforward case of religious defiance and ends as one of history's most successful branding campaigns, which is impressive considering it started with a beheading. A Roman officer under Emperor Diocletian, George refuses to renounce his Christianity during a wave of persecution and is executed in 303 AD, immediately achieving the kind of legacy most influencers would kill for, though ideally with less literal execution involved. What's fascinating is how quickly his story evolves from historical martyrdom into mythological spectacle, eventually gaining a dragon, a lance, and a permanent residency in medieval imagination centuries after his death. The irony is thick enough to cut with a sword he probably never used. A Greek-speaking Roman soldier becomes the patron saint of England, a country he never visited, symbolizing a national identity that didn't exist when he was alive. It's a reminder that history isn't just recorded. It's curated, shaped into something useful, something inspiring, and occasionally something wildly inaccurate. Because sometimes the truth isn't compelling enough, so we add a dragon. Segment 2 and Victory that breaks everything anyway. If St. George represents how we mythologize sacrifice, the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 shows what happens when victory doesn't quite stick the landing. Irish High King Brian Boru defeats a powerful alliance of Viking and regional forces in a battle that effectively ends large-scale Viking influence in Ireland, which sounds like a clean win until you realize it also kills Boru, his son, and his grandson, creating a leadership vacuum so complete it basically undoes the entire point of the victory. It's the historical equivalent of winning the championship and immediately dissolving the team. The battle itself is later framed as a holy war, conveniently aligning political conflict with religious narrative, because nothing tidies up a messy civil war like calling it divine. And yet, the reality is far more chaotic. Alliances were fluid, identities were mixed, and the aftermath left Ireland fragmented rather than unified. It's a pattern we see over and over again. The moment that looks like triumph from a distance often feels like collapse up close, especially when nobody's left to run the victory parade. Segment 3 and Rebellion, Betrayal, and the Cost of Being Right Too Early. By the time you get to the Revolt of the Comuneros in 1521, you start to notice a recurring theme. People tend to revolt right up until the moment it becomes a very bad idea. Spanish citizens rise against King Charles I, frustrated by foreign influence, heavy taxation, and the general sense that their government has been outsourced to people who don't even live there, which feels oddly familiar in a modern context. The rebels organize, demand reforms, and briefly look like they might succeed, right up until they don't. At the Battle of Villar, royalist forces crush the uprising, capture its leaders, and execute them the next day, turning political resistance into a cautionary tale with a very short turnaround time. What lingers, though, is the humanity of the moment. One leader asking to be executed first so he doesn't have to watch his friend die, which is both noble and tragically ineffective as a long-term strategy. The rebellion fails, the monarchy tightens its grip, and the system continues, proving once again that being correct about injustice does not guarantee success in fixing it. Segment 4 and Discovery, except for the people already living there. When Pedro Alvarez Cabral lands in Brazil in 1500, it's described as a discovery. which is a word historians have been side-eyeing ever since. Because discovering a place already inhabited by millions of people is less like exploration and more like showing up uninvited and announcing you own the house. Cabral's arrival marks the beginning of Portuguese colonization, which brings with it trade, religion, and an absolute avalanche of consequences for indigenous populations, including disease, forced labor, and cultural destruction. The initial interactions are documented with a kind of wide-eyed fascination, noting the beauty and perceived innocence of the native people, which would be touching if it didn't exist alongside immediate acts of coercion and control. It's the contradiction at the heart of colonial expansion. Admiration paired with exploitation. Curiosity paired with conquest. And the long-term result is a reshaped continent, a new global power structure, and a legacy that still echoes in debates about identity, history, and who gets to tell the story in the first place. Segment 5, and culture, collapse, and the stories that outlive us. April 23rd also gives us the death of William Shakespeare in 1616, which is less an ending and more a transition into literary immortality. Shakespeare dies in Stratford-upon-Avon, leaving behind a body of work that almost doesn't survive him, because at the time, most of his plays exist in fragile scripts that could easily have been lost. It takes years of effort by his colleagues to compile them into the first folio, preserving works that would go on to define language, storytelling, and the way we understand human behavior. There's a quiet irony here. One of the greatest writers in history nearly disappears because no one wrote him down properly. And yet, once preserved, his work becomes unavoidable, shaping centuries of culture. It's a reminder that legacy isn't just about creation. It's about preservation, timing, and a little bit of luck. Because sometimes the difference between obscurity and immortality is whether your friends decide to publish your stuff after you're gone. Segment 6, and from world wars to viral videos. Fast forward to April 23rd in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the scale shifts dramatically, but the themes stay oddly consistent. In 1945, Soviet forces push into Berlin, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, a moment of overwhelming military force that brings closure to one of history's darkest chapters, while simultaneously setting the stage for a new geopolitical tension in the Cold War. That same day, American troops liberate Flossenburg concentration camp, exposing the horrors of the Holocaust in undeniable detail and forcing the world to confront the consequences of unchecked power and ideology. And then, 60 years later, on April 23, 2005, a guy named Jawed Karim uploads an 18-second video called "Me at the Zoo," launching YouTube and, unintentionally, the entire modern content ecosystem. It's almost absurd. The same date that marks the collapse of totalitarian regimes also gives us the beginning of reaction videos and comment sections. But maybe that's the point. History doesn't move in neat categories. It stacks everything together: tragedy, triumph, innovation, and awkward footage of elephants, and lets future generations figure out what it all means. In conclusion, April 23rd is a reminder that history isn't a straight line of progress or decline, but a dense cluster of human decisions, each one shaped by belief, ambition, fear, or sometimes just opportunity. From martyrdom to rebellion, from conquest to creativity, the events of this day show how individuals and societies respond to power in all its forms. And if there's a lesson buried somewhere in all of it, it might be this: the stories we tell about history often matter just as much as the events themselves, because those stories are what shape how we remember, interpret, and occasionally repeat the past.